I'm definitely not a pastor, so I generally like hanging out in the back, running the sound, or rolling a cord up, or setting up, tearing down. That's more my favorite thing to do. But Chris ran through his list. I think he had 3 or 4, and as he kept going down the list, and everybody, no, 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 and then he gets to me, and I'm just bad at saying no, and so here I am. So my wife and I have been a part of Meadows since May of last year. May of last year, the church did a vision night. They met in a old, dusty, dirty warehouse. I think it had like a ½ inch of dust on the ground. And I joke with my wife that, she got us into this situation because we actually own a piece of land out in Elizabeth, and we were out on our land. It's just a raw piece of land. I was trying to get some fence up because I want to run some cattle out there, and so just had this open piece of land working on fence, and this was on a Sunday. I think must have been a Sunday night that they did vision night. So we're out there working on the fence, and Tiff, I could just tell she's like, let's leave. I want to go. I want to make it to this vision night because she had met Jesselyn through Facebook, and so she'd been hanging out with Jesselyn, but hadn't gone to the church. We were new to Castle Rock, and hadn't found a home church. So I could tell she wanted to leave the land and go to this vision night, which I was less than enthralled with, but I joke with, so we did leave. We went to Vision Night. Vision Night led to going to Chris and Jesselyn's small group, and that led to hosting house church. They kind of did some house churches before they actually launched on Sunday, and then we helped out with launching services on Sunday morning last October, which is when the church kind of launched. And then ultimately, a couple months ago, we started leading a small group. So if you are not in a small group and you're looking for a small group, I know of a really good one, so you can come talk to me afterwards. All right, so I've been praying a lot for this. Chris asked me about 3 weeks ago, and I prayed a lot about this sermon. I'm sort of laughing because this is a terrible joke, but my biggest prayer has been that the rapture would happen before we got here, but it didn't happen, so here we go. So this week we're continuing our story series. The goal of this series, as I kind of mentioned, is one, to hear something about somebody here at church. Get to know somebody that maybe you don't know their whole story. We got to hear who was John Henson, and then Nick last week, and then my wife Tiffany today. And I learned some new things about Tiffany that I didn't even know about. So it's really cool to hear these stories from people here at the church. And then the second goal is to hear and learn something new, possibly about a story that you know from the Bible or a character in the Bible. And then the third goal of it is ultimately that it leads us to a next step, kind of a next step in our walk, next step in our faith, next step, where is God calling us to from that. So, and I love the tagline that Chris put on this, which is "Life is beautifully complicated," and it really is. Life is complicated. It's beautifully complicated. We have our ups and our downs. We have our good moments and our bad moments. One moment we're on the mountaintop, and the next moment we're being crushed by life, or crushed by a decision or a bad decision we made. And we've seen that in both Jacob and Peter, who Chris talked about last week. Peter, one moment he's walking on water because he wants to know who Jesus is, or he wants to be with Jesus, and the next moment he's denying Jesus. He denies Jesus 3 times that he ever knew him or he even knows him. And then, later he's speaking to a huge crowd and thousands are coming to know Christ. But I love that Chris brings that out, and I think it's important to mention, and I feel like in the social media world that we always want to kind of characterize somebody by this one moment in their life. Like you saw Peter deny Jesus. Well, that must be who Peter is. Like he doesn't even know who Jesus is. He denies him. Or maybe this moment on the mountaintop where we say, well, that's who that person is, but that's not true. And God uses this weaving of these complicated lives to show His glory and His purpose. So we're going to see that another messy life. I like to call them messy lives, another word for beautifully complicated, but another messy life in the life of Moses this week. So Chris asked me to pick somebody that I identify with. You brought that up too soon, but Chris asked me to pick somebody that I identify with. That's a good picture of Moses. And I didn't even have to think about it because I was like, I've always identified with Moses. For anybody that knows the Moses story, he was kind of the reluctant leader. Some think that he had some kind of speech impediment because, he says that I'm slow of speech and tongue. But I knew Moses would be the guy that I would talk about. So We're going to talk about Moses. He's a pretty well-known character. Most of you probably heard many of the stories of Moses. Some of you may have seen Chris's favorite movie, The Prince of Egypt. I haven't seen that, so it probably disqualifies me to be here. But for any that know the OG movie on Moses, it's the 1956 movie starring Charlton Heston called The Ten Commandments. So I had a healthy diet of this growing up as a kid. My dad used to joke, it's a long movie, so he'd joke at night. He's like, hey, you want to watch a couple commandments tonight? Because you didn't have time for all 10. But anyway, to give a little context on Moses, I want to go back to a scripture in Genesis. So back in Genesis 15, Moses and God are talking. They're having this little conversation, and God, did I say God and Moses? I meant God and Abraham. God and Abraham are having this little conversation, and Abraham says to God, I don't have an heir. I'll have no descendants. And God says, yes, you will. You'll have a descendant, you'll have an heir, and you will have more descendants than the stars in the sky. And so it's right after this that we're going to read, and God makes this covenant with Abraham, or Abram as he's called here. And so we pick this up in Genesis 15, verse 13. And it says, then the Lord said to Abram, know for certain that your offspring will be sojourners in a land that is not theirs, and will be servants there, and they will be afflicted for 400 years. But I will bring judgment on the nation that they serve, and afterward they will come out with great possessions. So I want you to kind of just remember this as we go through this story, this idea of his descendants being afflicted for 400 years, and there'll be servants there, they'll be in this other nation, or this nation will be judged, and then they will come out. So Moses comes on the scene after the Israelites had been in captivity in Egypt for 350 years. So Moses is born. He's born at a time, the king of Egypt, Pharaoh, he was beginning to fear the Israelites. I'll say Israelites in Hebrew probably interchangeably throughout this as I talk. So same people, Hebrews, Israelites. The Bible references them many times as the Hebrews. But Pharaoh was fearing the Hebrews, the Israelites, and he was fearing that they'd be becoming very powerful, many in number, and probably afraid that they would take over. And so he was oppressing them. They were enslaved. He was using them to basically build his kingdom there in Egypt. And because of this fear of these of the Israelites, he actually tells the Hebrew midwives to kill every baby boy that's born. So he's like, hey, let's try to suppress them, just kill every baby boy. And the Hebrew midwives, it says they fear the Lord, and so they don't do that. And so this makes Pharaoh angry, and so he says, well, he tells his people, throw every baby boy into the Nile to kill them. And so this is when Pharaoh's born, or this is when Moses is born. And Moses has an older brother named Aaron, which you've probably heard of, and then he's got an older sister named Miriam. So Moses is born. His mom actually hides him. His mom is Jochebed, and she hides him for the first 3 months. And I can only imagine what this was like. We have a 2-month-old daughter, and we have no oppression, no fear, and we're always trying to keep them from crying. Or we even lived when we actually first moved to Colorado. We lived in a condo, and we had 2 walls that had neighbors on them, and we had this great fear of the kids waking the neighbors up in the middle of the night with crying or something like that. So we were always trying to keep them from crying, and we actually ended up with a neighbor beating on our wall in the middle of the night. So I can only imagine this situation where she's trying to keep this little baby from crying for fear that the baby would be found and possibly likely killed. So after 3 months, it says that she couldn't hide him anymore, and so she makes this basket, this papyrus basket, and she puts it in the Nile River. Exactly, it's interesting, the irony in the story and how God is working, because Pharaoh had asked that all baby boys be put in the Nile River, and his mom does that, but she puts him in this basket. And Miriam, his sister, kind of follows this basket as it goes along, and this basket ends up being seen by Pharaoh's daughter. And so Pharaoh's daughter picks this basket out of the river and opens it, and she knows that it's this Hebrew baby, and it's crying. And you would think maybe that story would end right there. Pharaoh's daughter picks up the baby. Pharaoh's trying to kill all the babies. You would think maybe she would take it to her dad, and that's the end of the baby. But that's not the end of the story. And so you see, it actually says that Pharaoh's daughter took pity on him. And so Miriam walks up just at the opportune moment and says, hey, do you want somebody, I'll find somebody that can nurse this baby. And they say, yes, yeah, go ahead. And so Miriam gets her mom, Jochebed, who was Moses' mom, and Pharaoh's daughter actually ends up paying Jochebed to nurse her own baby. And so this happens for probably until he's probably 6 months to 2 years, depending on what you read, until the baby was weaned. And then she gave this baby back to Pharaoh's daughter. So he was, again, probably 6 months to 2 years old. Pharaoh's daughter names him Moses, which means drawn out at that time. And so it's just cool to see the way God's working in this story, and God's purposes are still happening regardless of what evil is out there or what would like to be in control. So he's raised in Egypt. He's in Pharaoh's court. He spends the next 40 years there learning all the traditions and enjoying the luxuries of Egypt. Stephen, in his speech in Acts 7, actually says that he was mighty in his words and deeds. So you kind of get this picture of this powerful guy, rich, all the power of Egypt that he lived in there. But he seemed to he cared for his people. He knew he was Hebrew, and he cared for his people. And so you see he's out hanging out and watching these Hebrew people, his people that are enslaved and that are being oppressed. And he sees one of the Hebrews being beaten by an Egyptian taskmaster. And he steps in and tries to stop it, and who knows what his intention was, but ultimately he kills this Egyptian taskmaster. And he hides this Egyptian in the sand, thinks nobody saw him. And then the next day he's out again out with the Hebrew people, and he sees a couple of them quarreling, and he says, hey, knock it off, whatever. He has this sort of deliverer complex where he's trying to, bring peace or bring deliverance. Something in his head seems to be driven this way. And they say, who's made you a judge or a prince over us? Are you going to kill us just like you killed the Egyptian? And so at this point he realizes, hey, they know what I did. They know that I killed. People know. And so he flees Egypt. At this point he's 40 years old. So doing the math here, he's born 350 years that they'd been in captivity. He's now 40, so it's been 390 years that the Israelites have been in captivity there in Israel. So I can only imagine maybe they were thinking like, hey, our 400 years has almost come, deliverance is here, and then it's not. And then Moses flees, and he flees to the land of Midian, which was like going somewhere between 300 and 600 miles away, which is like going from here to Albuquerque, New Mexico. So it was a long distance away. So he goes to this land of Midian, and he sits down at this well, and there's these shepherds trying to water their sheep. And so there is 7 women there that are the daughters of the priest of Midian, and they're trying to water their sheep. And there's these other shepherds that are apparently harassing them. And I don't know exactly, it's not clear quite how this played out, but they were having a hard time watering their sheep. And so Moses interjects and helps them get their sheep watered. And then the daughters of Midian, these 7 women, go home. And their dad, who's Jethro, he said, hey, how'd you get home so fast? And they said, oh, well, this Egyptian delivered us. And he said, well, I want to meet this. And they do say Egyptian. I know I've mixed the words up a few times here, but they actually say an Egyptian rescued us. And so he wants to meet this person. Who's this person? And, of course, this person is Moses. And he gives one of the daughters to Moses to marry, which is Zipporah. And Moses actually ends up they have 2 children while they're here in the wilderness. But the first kid he names Gershom, which means banished or stranger there. So clearly Moses recognized, he's a stranger. He married a Zipporah, which would be a Midianite. She's a Gentile. Moses, I kind of missed in the beginning, but he was a Levite. So his mom and dad were Levite. He was of the Levite line. He's married this Gentile woman. He's in this foreign land, just miles away from the luxuries and power that he experienced in Egypt. So he spends 40 years here in the desert as a shepherd. He actually he works for his father-in-law, taking care of his father-in-law's sheep for 40 years. And I can only imagine that at this point he's likely given up on maybe doing anything significant. He he maybe thought when he was 40 there in Egypt, here's my time. I'm part of this prophecy that that will bring deliverance to my people. And here he is wandering around in the desert. It says actually near Horeb, which means a desolate place. It's interesting how every word in the Bible has a lot of meaning to it. But he's wandering around here in Horeb, 80 years old. Maybe it's nighttime, and he's reflecting back on that moment when maybe he made that big mistake and he killed that Egyptian. He's thinking, man, if only I wouldn't have made that mistake, maybe my life would be different. And then God enters. And he sees this burning bush, this bush that's on fire, but it's not burning up. And you all have heard the story. He walks over to this bush, and God speaks to him. And he says, take off your sandals. You're on holy ground. And God says, hey, I'm the God of your father, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And I've heard the cry of my people. And I want to deliver them. And I want to use you to deliver them. And Moses proceeds to kind of have this back and forth with God, and God says, I'm going to use you, and he's like, I don't think that's a good idea. And Moses says, God actually shows him these really mighty powers. Moses has a staff, and he throws it on the ground. It turns into a snake, and then he picks it up, and it turns back into a staff. And he puts his hand in his cloak, and it turns leprous, and he takes it out, and it's healed. And God says, well, If Pharaoh still doesn't believe, take some water out of the Nile and pour it out, and I'll turn it into blood. And so I can only imagine Moses, I don't know what his relationship with God is at this point, but he's having this amazing encounter with God, and God is doing these works right in front of him. And so we pick the story up here. You beat me to the scripture here, Nick, but we pick the story up here in Exodus 4, verse 10. And it says, but Moses, so all this that had happened, he showed him these wonders. And so we pick up, and it says, Moses said to the Lord, "O my Lord, I am not eloquent either in the past or since you have spoken to your servant, but I am slow of speech and of tongue." Then the Lord said to him, "Who has made man's mouth? Who makes him mute or deaf or seeing or blind? Is it not I, the Lord? Now therefore go, and I will be with your mouth and teach you what you shall speak." But he said, "O my Lord, please send someone else." This is very similar to the conversation I had with Chris when he called me. Chris, send someone else. So Moses, he's a reluctant leader. So you can just see this in him. He's just like, I've seen all these works, God. That's cool. You can do that, but can you send someone else? And God ultimately prevails and convinces Moses to go, and he gives Aaron to be his mouthpiece. And so Moses goes back to Egypt, and he tells, they gather all the Israelite leaders, and he tells them, hey, here's what happened. I talked to God, and he wants to deliver you. And I can imagine they were all excited. All right, man, this deliverance has come. It's been 400, so now Moses is 80. It's been 430 years now since they were captive in Egypt. So they may have thought, man, God, you said 400 years. How come, here now it's 430 years, they may have given up that they were ever going to be delivered. So they're all excited. Moses comes. Hey, God's going to deliver. And then Moses goes to Pharaoh and says, hey, God sent me to you to tell you to let my people go. And what does Pharaoh say? I don't know who God is. What are you talking about? I don't know who that God is. And it angers Pharaoh. And Pharaoh actually inflicts more pain on the Hebrews and makes them make bricks without straw. And it gets even worse, and it makes the Israelites angry at Moses. They're like, why did you do this to us? Now it's even worse. And in, I don't have this one on the screen, Nick, but in Exodus 5:22, it says, "Then Moses turned to the Lord and said, 'O Lord, why have you done evil to this people? Why did you ever send me?'" So things have only gotten worse when he went to talk to Pharaoh. This is not going how he'd planned or maybe how he'd hoped or how he'd envision it in his mind. So then they go through, you kind of know the story, they go through kind of this 10 cycles of plagues, and they go through a plague, and Moses said this plague is going to happen, and the plague happens, and Pharaoh relents, and he says, okay, I'll let your people go, just make this plague stop. And Moses asks God to stop the plague stops, and then Moses hardens his heart, and you kind of repeat that process. And it's very cool because each of these plagues were a direct response to some of the gods of Egypt. They had a god of the Nile, but the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, he controls the Nile. And they had a god of the crops, but God, the real God, controls the crops. And so it was a direct offense. Their gods couldn't control these plagues. And the 10th plague happens, which is when God says he's going to kill every firstborn. And some say this is a response to Pharaoh killing all the baby boys and all the firstborns. But God says, they have this option. They can kill a lamb and put that blood on their doorpost, and God will pass over that house. And so they celebrate this Passover the night before Pharaoh ultimately relents after this last plague and lets the people go. And so they go out after this 10th plague, and this has been 430 years since they were captive in Egypt. And it actually says 430 years to the day, which I think is really cool. God obviously had a plan. And there's somewhere, the numbers vary, depends on what you read, but somewhere around probably 2 million people that leave Egypt at this time. And so it also said in the prophecy back to Abraham that they would leave and they would take great possessions. And so I think Moses tells them to, hey, all the ladies ask them for jewelry and clothes. And they just give all this stuff. They're given favor with the Egyptians, and the Egyptians just give them all this stuff, and they leave and take all this with them. And God leads them with a pillar of cloud in the day and a pillar of fire at night. And it's just this really neat deliverance, like physical deliverance out of Egypt. I'm looking here to see if I'm gonna skip some things since I'm going slow here. Okay, I want to go to Exodus 13:17 here, Nick, which I have here on the screen. So Exodus 13:17, as they're leaving, it says, "When Pharaoh let the people go, God did not lead them by way of the land of the Philistines, although that was near, for God said, lest the people change their minds when they see war and return to Egypt. But God led the people around by the way of the wilderness toward the Red Sea, and the people of Israel went up out of the land of Egypt equipped for battle." And so I have a real quick little screen here I want to show of the map of Egypt. And so here's Goshen, Ramses, and this is the route that they took all the way. Well, here's where they crossed the Red Sea. So they come down here, and they ultimately come all the way here and back up to the Promised Land. The shortest way would have been to go right up here through the land of the Philistines to the Promised Land. But I just love this point where God knows them. He knows their heart. He knows that if he took them through land of the Philistines, that they would turn back quickly. And we know that they had their struggles. They head out of there. They cross the Red Sea. You've all heard the Red Sea crossing. Another really cool deliverance. You have to think that these people are learning who this God is. They probably, they spent 430 years in Egypt, may have lost kind of who this God is and they how to relate to him. And so they're learning about who this God is through all these experiences. So they cross the Red Sea. It's cool because there's a I'm going to skip, or I think I already took it out. I was going to skip a scripture that talks about, Moses says, as they're about to cross, he says, "Fear not, stand firm, for you shall see the salvation of God." It's actually the first place we see salvation in the Old Testament. So God is showing them who he is and bringing this salvation. So they spend another 3 months traveling in the wilderness. They run out of water. God provides them water. They get hungry. God gives them manna. They get tired of the manna. God gives them meat. And so then they end up back at Mount Sinai. So Mount Sinai, that's where Moses had the burning bush experience. He's back there where he spent 40 years taking care of his father-in-law's sheep, where he was a shepherd. And they camp at Mount Sinai, and God speaks to Moses, and he says, "If you will obey me and you'll follow my commandments, I will dwell among you." And Moses goes and talks to the people, and he says, "Here's what God said, if you'll obey me." And they said, "Whatever God says, we will do." And so God actually comes and dwells on Mount Sinai. It says it was engulfed by fire, and there was this plume of smoke coming out of it, and there was a cloud that surrounded it, and it was thunder and lightning on the mountain. I mean, it was this very physical presentation of God dwelling among them. And so God speaks to Moses. He goes up on the mountain, and it says God spoke to Moses in the thunder and the lightning. Pretty cool experience. I can only imagine what that was like. But God speaks to Moses, and this is where he gives Moses the 10 Commandments. And he gives him another 52, I think, laws that kind of fill in some of this 10 Commandments. And again, these are, all they knew is maybe the laws of Egypt and how those people related. And God's giving this new way to live, this new way to relate to each other and to God. And so Moses spends 40 days up there receiving these laws and these 10 Commandments. And the people grew tired, and they grew tired of waiting on Moses to come back. And so they decide to create a new God. And they ask Aaron, Moses' brother, to make them a god. And so they give him all this jewelry and all this gold. And Aaron creates this golden calf. This is probably something they were familiar with in Egypt, something that was, maybe that they had golden cows in Egypt. And so they thought, hey, we need this physical God that we can worship. So they make this golden calf. And I want to pick up here in the story on Exodus 32, verse 9. It says, "And the Lord said to Moses, 'Go down, for your people whom you brought up out of the land of Egypt have corrupted themselves. They have turned aside quickly out of the way that I commanded them. They have made for themselves a golden calf and have worshipped it and sacrificed to it, and said, These are your gods, O Israel, who brought you up out of the land of Egypt.' And the Lord said to Moses, I have seen this people, and behold, it is a stiff-necked people. Now therefore, let me alone, that my wrath may burn hot against them, and I may consume them, in order that I may make a great nation out of you." But Moses implored the Lord his God and said, O Lord, why does your wrath burn hot against your people, whom you have brought out of the land of Egypt with great power and with a mighty hand? Why should the Egyptians say, with evil intent did he bring them out, to kill them in the mountains and to consume them from the face of the earth? Turn from your burning anger and relent from this disaster against your people. Remember Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, your servants, to whom you swore by your own self, and said to them, I will multiply your offspring as the stars of heaven, and all this land that I have promised I will give to your offspring, and they shall inherit it forever. And the Lord relented from the disaster that he had spoken of bringing on his people. And I love this piece because you see Moses now he's acting as an intercessor, as a mediator for these people. Before he thought, he's physically thinking he's going to deliver these people. I'm going to overpower the Egyptians. I'm going to do it myself. And now he believes God for the deliverance, and he's even repeating back to God what he knows about God. And it continues in Exodus 32:30. It says, The next day Moses said to the people, You have sinned a great sin, and now I will go up to the Lord. Perhaps I can make atonement for your sin. So Moses returned to the Lord and said, Alas, this people has sinned a great sin. They have made for themselves gods of gold. But now, if you will forgive their sin, but if not, please blot me out of your book that you have written. So you see this character of Moses is changing as he's gone through life, and he's gone through these experiences, and he's gone through these encounters with God. And now he's at this point where he's saying, God, if you won't forgive them, I'll die so that these people may have life. And it's a pretty cool moment because this is a foreshadowing of Jesus. This is a foreshadowing of what ultimately somebody that could die on behalf of their sin and give them life. And so obviously Moses couldn't do that. He wasn't perfect like Jesus, but you see this character of Christ presented in him. And so Moses has definitely changed over time, and he's trusting God for deliverance rather than himself. So shortly after this, they leave Mount Sinai, and they send the 12 spies out into the promised land. 10 of them come back and say, well, let's say 2 of them come back and say, we can do this. We can overpower. We can take on this promised land. We can go. And 10 of them come back and give a bad report. And everybody believes the bad report, and they don't believe God will deliver them and save them. And so they end up spending another 40 years in the wilderness, wandering around until that generation passed away that didn't believe that God would deliver them. And so we come towards the end of Moses' life here, and he is now 120 years old. And Moses didn't get to go into the promised land. He'd actually disobeyed God in some of this journey that they had through the wilderness that I kind of skipped over because we don't have time. But he doesn't get to go into the wilderness, but God takes him up on this mountain, and he shows him from this mountain the promised land. He can see the promised land where God's going to take him. And ultimately, it says that he died there and God buried him. So, but I wanted to just read some of the descriptors of Moses towards the end of his life. It says in Numbers 12 that he was described as the meekest man on the face of the earth. And meek doesn't mean necessarily scared or timid. I looked up the definition. It says mild of temper, soft, gentle, not easily provoked or irritated. Again, it's the character of Christ coming out in his life. You see Moses get frustrated, but I can only imagine if it was not a meek person, not the meekest person on the face of the world, according to the Bible, he probably would have lost his temper. And when God said, I'll consume them all and I'll make a great nation out of you, maybe that person would have said, yeah, that sounds like a good idea. I can be better than those people. Well, you see this humility and this mild, this grace of Moses in his life. He's also, in Deuteronomy 34, he's described as a servant of the Lord. And then in Deuteronomy 34, it also says, there's not arisen, a prophet has not arisen like him, whom the Lord knew face to face. Deuteronomy 34:10, and there's not risen a prophet since in Israel like Moses, whom the Lord knew face to face, none like him for all the signs and the wonders that the Lord sent him to do in the land of Egypt, to Pharaoh and to all his servants and to all his land. So you see Moses at the beginning of his life, and you see that he's going to do it himself. He feels maybe he's got the strength or the power or the might or the lineage. Maybe he said, man, I'm a Levi, I can do this. I got the prophecy on my side. God saved me for this moment, but it wasn't the time, and Moses wasn't at the place where he needed to be yet.